World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. Today we'll be looking at a Serbic response. Amid a backdrop of violence sparked by Western recognition of Kosovo's independence, Belgrade and its ethnic Serb allies elsewhere say their struggle will continue. Is this a short-lived reaction or a sign of wider, unfinished business in the Balkans? Purging Pervez. After a resounding parliamentary electoral victory, the opposition coalition in Pakistan is vowing to isolate or oust President Pervez Musharraf. Does he remain an indispensable U.S. ally? Or should Washington bid farewell to its man in Islamabad? Mission accomplished. After a largely muted response by the international community, Turkey ended its military incursion into northern Iraq. What does the general acceptance of this violation of Iraqi sovereignty tell us about the current political landscape? Meeting Raul. After announcing his retirement, Fidel Castro formally stepped aside this week in favor of his brother Raul. U.S. presidential candidates were quick to offer differing visions of an appropriate American response. Has the time come for Uncle Sam to extend a hand to Havana? To help us explore these issues, we're joined by John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Director of Program for Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome back to World Affairs Roundup. We got to start with our wittily termed acerbic reaction. And John, I want to turn to you as someone who served in Kosovo. As you look ahead at this, we have 2 very different examples of where this might go in the Balkans. There's the Slovenian example of Slovenia declares independence, relatively easy, nonviolent departure from the Union. And then, of course, we have Bosnia, where their independence occasioned a very bloody civil war, years of political turmoil. So do you see Kosovo as perhaps going down either one of those roads or some third way?
The third way. Kosovo is much more complicated because of the historical connections, and we've gone through that on any number of times. The Serbs see it as the birthplace of their civilization, of their culture. But imagine this: Kostunica, hardline prime minister for Serbia, flanked by the anointed president of Russia and the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, and he's saying the only way is partitioning. That's the difference between Bosnia and Slovenia.
Partitioning within Kosovo? Or
within Kosovo.
Okay.
Now, having traveled around Kosovo, this gets very complicated. There is a piece in Mitrovica, near the north, near the Serbian border, that could be broken off. It would mean the displacement of a significant number of Albanians in the process, but there is a majority of Serbs living in that area. The rest of the Serbs are in pockets all around the country, generally adjacent to one of the historical churches that go back to the 12th century and which are considered very important for the Serbs as well. The possibility of bringing those along with this is just impossible. That just isn't going to work. But I think what I see in this is that Kostunica and possibly Tadic, and I can't imagine a Serb leader who is going to take a position against or in favor of the independence of Kosovo. So a partitioning may be the last gasp on this. We also should look at what Russia's role in this. And it all reminds me of an early American president, James Monroe, and the Monroe Doctrine. And Russia is exerting a level of don't mess around in my backyard kind of thing. And we're down in Georgia, we're down in Ukraine, and Russia is asserting itself again.
Traditionally, countries are trying to deter other countries from breaking away or declaring independence. And this is a process that's been going on for some time, whereas if many of the big powers wanted to stop it, they could have stopped it, the United States, France, Germany, but they didn't.
Right.
So why is this case different than many other cases we see around the world?
Well, the analyses that I've read indicate that they say this is a special case because of the ethnic cleansing that took place that led to the NATO intervention in 1999 when so many Albanians were crossing the border. Beyond that, it's a little hard to see why this is such a special case. The EU is very divided on this because of the fact that Spain and others have their own areas that this could legitimate their declarations of, or at least their movements, independence movements. So I find it a little bit puzzling that they had to do this, that the EU has committed so much money to prop up, as well as troops, when the EU is so divided. And the United States' quick recognition as well. I tend to think that probably the process got moving in such a way that they couldn't stop it after the report was issued by the UN Special Envoy. And the UN was prepared to pull out because that was the deadline that had been set, and there were some unfortunate consequences because surely this is not, I don't think this is over. I don't think the Serbs are going to go away, and it's like it's really taking on the Russians in a big way.
Well, given that, Robert, why is this in the U.S. interest then? So if it potentially is opening up this can of worms of other countries who have ethnic minorities who want to break away, if it's yet another antagonism with Russia, why was the U.S. one of the first to really jump in and recognize Kosovo?
Well, it's interesting. It's almost as if the EU countries that are for this and the United States feel that Serbia somehow abrogated the right to rule this area back in the late 1990s. It hasn't really been a functional part of Serbia. And so if the UN mandate's going to end, then they can't go back to Serbia. And so you go along with this. But there doesn't seem to have been much of a plan around that. It just seems to have, I think Anne's right, it seems to have gone forward just by a momentum of its own, but then people were going to line up on one side or the other. I mean, this goes back to we're back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire here, and the right of self-determination, right? Like a Wilsonian kind of doctrine, the nation can declare its own independence, which is not a right in international law, but is something that a lot of ethnicities believe in and has a background in human rights history. So it looks like it's going to spin out in various ways with Russia and Serbia trying to push back, maybe having to compromise on partition.
Let me add one point to what you were saying on the history of this intervention. This is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, throw us back to 1648 and the Treaty of Westphalia, which set up the nation state and the idea of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And it's only within the last couple of U.S. administrations that we have been doing damage to that. This is a relatively new thing, and now when someone begins to question it on the other side, we don't quite like it as much as when we do the intervening.
Well, I suppose as you say, John, this is going to continue for a while, so I'm sure we'll be talking about it again. I want to move over to Pakistan, and maybe I'll start with you on this one. The U.S. has backed Musharraf even after the poll results, saying that he's still very important. Is this a case of where the U.S. really should find a way to cut the ties, or are people jumping too quickly on the dump Musharraf bandwagon?
I think we have to wait and see. Senator Biden did come out and say that he thought that Musharraf was about to go. I think the worst thing that could happen would be if it was perceived that the U.S. played any kind of role in either propping him up or telling him to leave at a particular time, because there are very strong forces at work in Pakistan right now with the parties that won the election, the anti-Musharraf parties, trying to form a coalition. It's very unclear whether or not that will work, but I think we have to sit and wait and see if it plays itself out. I mean, if they are able to somehow put together a coalition that would give them enough power to do the kinds of things they're talking about, like abolishing the National Security Council that Musharraf set up and making major changes in the way Pakistan is governed, well, we'll have to see that play itself out, but it's not at all clear that that's going to happen.
Robert, so is Musharraf an indispensable part of the war on terrorism? In other words, can the Bush administration prosecute the war on terrorism as it has if there's no Musharraf?
Maybe not the way it's been doing it, but I would say yes. I mean, if we believe there can be a war on terror per se. The thing is, there's a fragile coalition here. There's an opening for development of real civil society. Its roots are very shallow. And what's unifying all of these, all of the current group that was elected is Musharraf, quite frankly. That's what unifies them. So you almost want him to stay in the scene long enough to keep them unified without having him powerful enough to muck it up, so to speak. But our seeming support for him has caused a firestorm and has damaged our relationship with all of the two major parties that were elected. And so what we need to somehow do here is to show enough neutrality so that we can work with this fledgling democracy. The best case here would be, since the army is much stronger than civil society, is for this to become more like a Turkish situation, our later example on the show, where the military defends democracy as opposed to having coups and trying to run the country.
So John, is Musharraf indispensable? Is he not quick to exit, or is this the last we're going to see of him?
He's not indispensable. Obviously, the four of us are indispensable for the show. Beyond that, everyone else is likely to go. The key question, though, is where is the Army on this? The Army stayed out of the election process, allegedly said that it reduced the amount of monkeying about that would have moved it in one direction or another. Musharraf is also being very careful at this point in time. We need a figure in Pakistan strong enough to be able to exert some level of control over both the Army and the intelligence service, to be able to prosecute, to keep down that borderline warfare that we're facing there. Whether it's going to be Musharraf or Kayani, if he rises up,
the current head of the Army.
But I am not as enthusiastic about this new coalition. There is very little that they have in common, other than the fact that they see a common enemy, and their fingers have been slapped several times in the past, a number of them, some of the more important ones, for taking a little bit too much from the till. And so I can't imagine that they're going to be hold back in terms of trying to get the positions and getting access to the cash, and so we're going to have to watch this one carefully.
Robert, you mentioned the public in Pakistan has been kind of irked by the U.S. support for Musharraf. Is this a case of hearts and minds? I mean, are we in danger of losing the more popular electorate in Afghanistan? I mean, in Pakistan?
I think we are. I mean, Musharraf lost this election resoundingly. And we really could. John may be right that this group can't get their act together, but on the other hand, you have the possibility of maybe building a real civil society here if you could hold this coalition together in some way. And so this is shall we say, much more promising situation for building an actual authentic democracy than, say, Iraq has been over the last few years in that nation-building effort.
Now you mentioned the key word. We're going to talk about Iraq and Turkey after we come back from a short break. We'll be back in just a moment here on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup. We're talking about the week's issues with John Katzka, Ann Hamilton, and Robert Kraig. And Ann, maybe I'll start with you on the Turkish incursion into Iraq. And there's a part of me that is saying, is this kind of much ado about nothing, where the parties concerned, the Iraqis, at least some of the Kurds, the United States, were tolerant of Turkey coming over, as long as they didn't make too big of a mess, because they don't like the PKK militants. And so these issues about small issues of sovereignty were kind of shoved aside, or is this truly a major sort of destabilizing trend that we're seeing in Iraq?
I think of it as the first, the much ado about nothing. There are some Turkish bases already in the north of the very north of Iraq. There have been numerous incursions in the past. The PKK does run across the border, and they have chased them in the past. I think that the help, and I think you're right. The PKK is very unpopular, not just amongst many parties. So, in my opinion, it's much ado about nothing. And I think that the part that got a little messy was when Defense Secretary Gates was talking to the Turks, and they said, well, we don't know, you've been in Afghanistan for a very long time, so perhaps we'll stay there too. And then you could imagine this escalation and a much greater problem. But the fact that they pulled out the day after that conversation is an indication that they didn't want it to escalate that far.
Well, then remember, is this a kind of convenient sort of, this ended before it went too far, but as Anne said, if as the Turks said, hey, we could have stayed much longer if we wanted to, are we just lucky that they got out when they did, and so there's not a bigger problem, or is this kind of an over and done with episode?
I mean, it looks like they'll continue to have a military focus when they can, but that they'll stay within certain confines. They're very interested in the future and someday joining the EU, and so having a permanent, year-long occupation of parts of northern Iraq wouldn't work well for that. But there does seem to be a notion that they can have a military solution to this crisis, as opposed to a political solution, where they give their Kurdish minority, which is substantial, 14 million people, enough economic rights and social rights within society to further dampen support for the PKK. One estimate I saw is that there's probably about a third of the population that supports the PKK. That's still a lot of people. That's plenty to support military efforts by the PKK for years to come, unless they reduce support further with a political solution.
John, you were mentioned earlier when we were talking about Kosovo, the issues of precedent, and one of the ability to intervene across the border if you need to. The other is this idea of who can declare independence and how, and whether they get recognized. What are the precedential impacts of this incursion?
Actually, I see this as laying down markers. I think one of the reasons they pulled out quickly is it's wintertime there. This isn't a particularly great place to be running around. The international reaction, I think they could have weathered for a while, certainly longer than they did. The fact that Vice President Cheney canceled his visit there was not likely to be the biggest thing in the world in terms of their decision making. But looking at the markers they laid down, the military lays down a marker to Erdogan, the prime minister, that when they think it's in Turkey's interest, they will move. They have markers down to the PKK, that they can't hide on the borders. There's markers down to the Iraqi Kurds that don't think too much in terms of autonomousness in their particular part of the world. It may be better for them to be more federated into Iraq so as not to raise the Turkish interest in this area. So the precedents are more difficult. I think the precedents work very nicely when you're a very strong world power. You can set all the precedents you want. When you're a small, rather a little insignificant country, then you don't have any precedents at all.
And Robert's talking about a longer-term solution, in that as much as the Turks may try, the support for the PKK is going to continue. The PKK itself will most likely continue, and you still have this problem of the broader Kurdish communities in Turkey and Iran and other places. Will it take that? Will it take a resolution to that problem to ultimately guard against further military incursions?
Well, I think that I don't actually see it as a military solution to the problem. I think that although there are a significant number of people who do support the PKK, I think that marginalizing them through the process of giving them greater economic and cultural rights, and also this carrot, which has been out there for many, many years, of joining the European Union. I think that over time, the support for the PKK will diminish. The military will go along with it, will help to diminish it, but I think that they go hand in hand, where you strengthen the desire of the majority of the Kurds to integrate into the Turkish population, and try to diminish the appeal of the PKK by offering out those carrots. So I see them as going hand in hand. I don't think it can be solved militarily. I mean, it's like you can't win a terrorist war militarily because another terrorist will spring up. So
according to you, Anne, but others think you can. No. I think we may be in agreement on that. Robert, just one last quick thing. This issue of Iraqi sovereignty, we're very quick to sort of retaliate against Iran or Syria, anybody who's letting foreign fighters into Iraq and the presence of al-Qaeda and others into Iraq as a violation of Iraqi sovereignty and a threat to others. Yet the Turkish sort of example seems to be somewhat cutting against that because we're treating Iraqi sovereignty as being a little bit malleable. Again, we're talking about the presidential. How does that precedent set?
I think John's right. There seems to be no consistency here. There's a right of secession in Kosovo when we like the secession. There's a right to incursion if we like the incursion, right? If we think that Lebanon the forces in southern Lebanon need to be taken on, then that's fine. But then we're more queasy about the Turkish, abrogation of sovereignty, but upset terribly about any abrogation of sovereignty by Iran towards Iraq. So there seems to be no consistency. It's a matter of what any great power wants at a given time.
I want to move to the momentous foreign policy event of perhaps of the millennium. Fidel Castro has finally stepped aside in Cuba, the day that U.S. policy has been working toward for decades. So, Robert, this is truly a watershed event, yes?
Well, it seems more similar to the Soviet Union when some people have compared it to when Brezhnev died and we had Andropov and Chernenko. And so it looks like the last stage of the revolution is in gerontocracy in this case and a number of communist countries. So it's the old generation in charge still, and it doesn't seem like there are going to be any quick moves whatsoever. And it doesn't seem like there's going to be political will on the side of the United States to see this as a major change in terms of Cuban policy. So it seems to be a caretaker situation until the old guard actually passes on, or what John McCain said this week. He's hoping that Fidel Castro meets Karl Marx very soon.
John, how do we respond to this? I mean, we've heard different positions from the various candidates about how seriously to respond to this or not. What's your take on what the U.S. response should be?
I would say at this point we don't do anything. I mean, there does need to be some action within Cuba in terms of direction. We don't have a clue. We're led to believe that they would prefer a Chinese or a Vietnamese model where they maintain strong central control and open up some economic forces. Well, the problem is that the way Cuba is constructed right now, it looks more like Eastern Europe than it does like China or Vietnam. They don't have that large rural base that they used to have. It's become very urban. And so what they do need is the liberalization in order to be able to open up the market. So I'm not sure that's going to work. It's also not going to work if we just bury our head in the sand and say this isn't going to change. We aren't going to change until they change. But I see some forces happening on this issue. One, obviously, the Soviet support has gone away. Maybe Andropov and Chernenko are hiding out now in Havana. But more importantly, though, the newer refugees that have come out of Cuba are not as antagonistic towards Cuba. And the second generation of of the emigres that came over, that were the most anti-communist, aren't either. And increasingly, they want to see more contacts between the two and visit them. And so I see that there's going to be the political nature of the Cuban issue is going to dissipate to a degree in Florida. Mm-hmm. And also that takes away the angst in Washington about how to deal with it.
And we're running out of time quickly, and I apologize for that. So I'll give you the option of either picking up on the Raoul question, or if there's another issue that you want to highlight for us to keep our eyes on in the days and weeks to come.
Well, although it seems like a non-issue, the move to the presidential election in Russia, which is coming up, it certainly played a role in the debate with the failure of Hillary Clinton to know the name of the incoming president, who hasn't been elected yet, but will be, Medvedev. But I think it is really important because there is going to be a transition, and it's not, although everybody thinks that Putin will be the power behind the throne, it's not completely clear that that's going to happen. So it'll be interesting to watch how that process plays itself out, particularly with the issue in Serbia and Kosovo now.
Just a few seconds left, Robert.
March 19th is the 5th anniversary of the war of our invasion of Iraq, and the federal budget is up in play. So there's going to be a lot more attention now to the question of how much we're spending there rather than on domestic priorities and investing in America's future, so to speak. So that's going to be a huge issue in the next couple of weeks.
John, last quick word to you.
The European Union versus the Mediterranean Union. Germany versus France. This is starting to pop up. Watch for this one.
Great. John Katzka, Ann Hamilton, Robert Kraig, thank you very much for another insightful World Affairs Roundup. To our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.